Hi, I'm Doug, your tech support representative here at Atlantic British. And in this video, we're going to show you how to do a regular maintenance item, where we consider regular maintenance, for the 40, 46, Discovery 2, Range Rover, the Classic, any of the older Land Rovers with the 40, 46, even the 3.9 and 4.2. What happens is the valve cover gaskets, they're notorious for leaking. You can put brand new ones in there, and next thing, 8 months to a year later, they're leaking again. So you might as well consider them regular maintenance. What we're going to do is we're going to touch base in this video. We're going to use a 2002 Discovery 2, very common vehicle. You see a lot of them out there. Essentially, we're going to start with how to remove the throttle body without having to disconnect coolant lines. We're going to replace the upper intake manifold gasket, which means we're going to be taking the upper intake off, which you're going to need to do with the Bosch design because the upper bolts are hidden underneath the intake manifold. We'll give you some footnotes on some of the vehicles that are equipped with secondary air. This vehicle will not be equipped with secondary air. Your valve cover gaskets, and then while you have that passenger side valve cover off, we'll show you how to replace the oil separator. They have a tendency to plug up. They act like a PCV valve. So when they do become restricted or plugged, you're going to end up drawing and using more oil than you need to. So the parts you're going to need, basically starting from the throttle body gasket, ERR 6623. We have the upper intake manifold gasket, ERR 6621. A pair of valve cover gaskets, they're the same part number, LVC 100260. And then the oil separator itself, which is really just looks like a little plastic Christmas tree, LLJ 000010. That's all you're going to need as far as parts goes. Wouldn't hurt to have a gasket scraper or a scrubby pad. We're going to clean those areas up pretty well, and then we'll show you how it's done. Alright, what we're going to do is we're going to start with removing the throttle body. Now, you basically have two options on this. You can do it one of two ways. When we get down to the point where we take the throttle body off, you can just leave the throttle body hooked up to the cooling lines and just laying off to the side. Or if you prefer to remove it, or if you have other services you want to do, like the heater plate or whatnot, you can always take a pair of pinch-off pliers or a small pair of needle nose and pinch off the two leads that feed the coolant going into the heater plate, and then just take the throttle body out completely. So first we're going to start with, you can lift the cables and then bring up both the throttle and the cruise control cable. We're going to just wiggle those out of the slots that they give you to access and get those out. One goes out the front, the back one goes out the back. So now your cables are disconnected. And we're going to take out the air intake assembly in one piece. And we're going to loosen this clamp. And then you have squeeze clamps that hold the lines that feed the air intake. This is your idle air module right here, and you just get up underneath that second loop and it just pops right off. Your mass airflow sensor connector, you squeeze the two top tabs and you just lift up gently. We don't want to bend any pins. And then the clip for the wire, that's out of the way. These are the two retainer clips that hold the front of the mass airflow sensor housing on. And then we just give it all a wiggle and take the whole thing out complete. Now we got the air line off. What we're going to do is we're going to disconnect the throttle position sensor and your breather tube. And the breather tube has the same style clip that we just popped off on the idle air control motor. It's a little more difficult to get at, but it does pop. And we'll slide that down out of the way so that we leave the clamp on the hose so we don't lose it. Once that's disconnected, now you can get a good view of the connector here for the throttle position sensor. And that just has a small tab on the front face that we're just going to lift away and push down on the connector, and that'll drop right off there. And that's off. So now, other than the two coolant lines, we have everything disconnected from the throttle body. Now we're going to take the 4 bolts out so we can lift it away from the upper intake. Alright, so we have 2 bolts on top, 2 bolts on the bottom, 8mm or 5/16 head, We take those 4 out and we'll be able to just pop this loose and pull it away a little bit. One note I want to mention, on some of the older vehicles and even on the Bosch vehicles, if they got some miles on them, one of the lines that feeds this cooler is a plastic line that runs all the way across to the expansion tank. They get hard and brittle as they get older. So if you give it a sort of a wiggle and it feels very stiff and tight, you may want to just do the clamp off and take the lines off completely so that we don't break this plastic line when you flex it or move the throttle body. We took the 4 bolts out, and it's just a matter of give a tap to break it loose. Here's the throttle body, there's the lines. We've got a fairly new cross line on this, the vent line for the heater tube, for the heater plate. So we can either let this hang here or move this up and sort of get it out of the way when we're going to get into the valve cover. What we're going to do is, and I'll show you now, if you decide that you want to fully remove the throttle body, we're going to do some cleaning, or you're going to replace the bottom plate. We'll pinch off these 2 lines. You can use either a needle nose vice grip, or they do make a smooth jaw pliers, locking pliers, for this specific purpose, and we're going to show you both. Okay, so here we have the small locking vice grips, and I'm going to say my own personal preference is don't go cheap on these. If you want to get a good set of locking pliers in the long run, they'll do you well. So we're just going to pull this forward so we've got better access to the hoses, and we're just simply going to pinch off that rubber hose. And then to show you the other option, these are designed specifically for pinching off rubber hoses. As you can see, you got a nice smooth rounded jaw. There'll be no digging into the rubber, no breaking into it. These work good even on the older hoses that are a little on the tight side. And then once you squeeze these in, they'll lock in place. And we can just drop that right over on the corner of the rubber part of that hose. And we'll squeeze that off. And as you can see, they stay locked. So now we're just going to pop the 2 clips off. These are the same style clip that we use to remove the breather hose and the idle air control motor hose. These will pop right off. We'll slide those out. She's going to drip a little coolant, so you may want to tuck a rag underneath. And then once we've done that, we'll have the throttle body off and out of the way. I'm just going to show you, this is the way the throttle body would sit on the engine. And what you have underneath is a little heater plate. These are 5.5 millimeter bolts. We're going to get into another, we'll do another video, and we're going to show you how to replace this. And then this is your throttle position sensor. This sits on the back side. This is the sensor that we disconnected the 1 line for, and your breather tube. This is a good opportunity now. In most cases, you're going to find the whole back side of this is all going to be dark brown varnish and buildup and whatnot. And it's just a huge improvement on drivability, making sure that that's clean. Take a little carburetor cleaner, or there's a number of different varnish cleaners out there, and then just wipe this out and get that bore good, smooth, and clean. Alright, so the next step, what we're going to do is we're going to remove, or just move, the air conditioning compressor out of the way, because as you can see, you got 2 lines here that are going to interfere with the removal of the valve cover on this side. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove the upper shield, the fan, and then simply disconnect the belt. And then with the 4 bolts on top of the compressor and the electrical connection, you can actually pick that up and move that out of the way without having to disconnect any of the lines. Got a 36 millimeter nut on the back of the fan. Then on your tensioner, you have a 15 millimeter bolt right on the end. And then we're going to just simply take the tension off the belt, slip it right off the bottom pulley, and come up. So then you can slip your belt right off the compressor pulley. We'll just let that hang to the side. Move the cables out of the way. You have an electrical connection here with a tab right on top. You'll compress that till you hear it click, and then just give it a wiggle. And then we got 3 10 millimeter head bolts that have easy access and then you have one hidden underneath the control lines, the cables, and we'll just get at that with a ratcheting box wrench. An open end will do too. Alright, so we got the back bolt out. The compressor is held in place with locating dowels that sometimes lock themselves in place, so you can get down underneath it with a long screwdriver or a small pry bar. Just pop that up out of there. Now, a nice convenient place to put this air conditioning compressor. We take the two clips out of the air box, take the cover off. We actually have a nice flat surface right here on the air filter, which is strong enough to support it. We're just going to slide that right out of the way, and now we have this area clear. So now we're going to get into removing the upper intake manifold. Alright, so far you probably noticed we're doing a 4-liter without secondary air. For those of you that have an 03 to 04 with the secondary air, I'm going to show you the additional plumbing that you're going to run into when you're doing this assembly. Now what you have is across the back of the intake manifold, you have the cross tube. This goes to that plastic pump that's mounted on the firewall. This is nothing more than just a squeeze and remove end on it. You have serrated edges that show you where to place your fingers to squeeze, and then that'll release that, and you'll wiggle that and that'll come off. This tube runs across the back of the intake, and then I'm going to be showing you as we get into it two 8mm head bolts that bolt to the top of the coil assembly, but they also run through this bracket that attaches and holds this in place in the back of the intake. You're going to have clamps on the end of this that clamp these to the diverter valves, and you'll see a pipe assembly like so that attaches to the exhaust manifolds, and then it runs to two studs on the side of the upper intake that hold it in place, and those studs are going to run through these two top bolts. These bottom nuts on the original design, especially if it's been there for a while, can freeze in place pretty well. So normally what I do is, instead of trying to remove these and take the whole assembly out, you can actually take a small stud puller, because that's what's going to be in the manifold. They're not going to be bolted, they're going to be studs. And you can remove the studs, which will free up the connection here, and we'll be able to lift the intake manifold away from these without unbolting them from the exhaust manifold. Makes life a lot easier. So I just wanted to point that out, so those of you that get into this and raise the hood and say, hey, I have more plumbing than what you're showing in your video, it's because you have secondary air and this is what you're going to be running across. So now getting back to the upper intake, first we're going to do, let's get all the electrical connections and the plumbing that is connected to this out of the way. First off, this is the tube that feeds the purge valve for the secondary, or for the emission controls. That has two hidden squeeze buttons basically on both sides of this, and they're covered with a rubber coating, or a cover basically, that you grab them, you can squeeze and lift, this will come right out. That gets that out of the way. We will disconnect the electrical connector, which is push this metal bracket in and remove. Now this is just clipped into place on the intake, so we're just going to pop that out, and we're going to tuck it in under here to get that out of the way. Next we have the cables. This is your cruise control and your throttle cable. Okay, and that swings out of the way. We have a retainer clip here. Some of you may also have a retainer clip mounted right on top of the idle air control motor. Same thing, just pop that out. It will line right up with this white marker that they put on the cable. Okay, next what we're going to do is move this hose right here, only because it blocks one of the bolts that we're going to need to remove to get this out. So you don't even really necessarily have to fully remove it. We can just unclip it there. Let's throw these in the middle so we don't lose them. Let's see which end comes off easier. We twist up. I just like to stick it right on there. This way we won't lose track of that. And last but not least, we have one more electrical connector in the back. This is the same thing. This has the metal tab to release it. Alright, and that pops that off. Alright, now we're going to move around to the other side and we're going to disconnect the plumbing on the passenger side. Alright, so we have two vacuum lines on this particular unit, and I'm going to reiterate that you're going to have a third line if you have secondary air. There's a vacuum source that comes from the intake right here, and you're going to have a vacuum harness that runs on both sides of the engine and it gets its source there. You're also going to have a black canister right about here with a vacuum line on each side of it. You're going to disconnect those as well, because once you get the intake out, it's best to move that vacuum source of the harness out of there, because that's also made of this plastic that this gets brittle over age. So the more you flex it, the more chances you have of breaking it. If it is real brittle to feel, probably I would suggest is replace it, because if it hasn't broken now in the process of this service, probably not too far down the line it's going to crack and create a vacuum leak. Vacuum lines are important to keep in good shape. They also affect your fuel economy. They affect your power source. You want to make sure those vacuum lines stay solid. Alright, so having said that, we're going to remove the vacuum source line for the power brake booster, and that's just a matter of push that in until it seats that red cap. Hold the cap in place, pull the line out. And we're going to slide that down out of the way as well. Then we have another one of those snap clamps. This is your basically your PCV hose. Runs into your oil separator down into the passenger side cover. And then we have, on this case now, some of these, a lot of these actually will have two studs right here with a nut on them, which makes life a lot easier if you take a stud remover and take the studs out. You can always replace the studs with bolts, which will make it a lot easier when you go to reassemble it. And for now we have an 8mm head bolt down there. We're going to take that out. And what that does is a bracket off the bottom that supports the two heater hoses. And from there we can always take a pry bar or a long screwdriver and get in behind it and just a little tweak out, just to clear it away from the manifold a little bit to help us when we go to slide the manifold out of there. Alright, so we've got the vacuum lines off, we've got the breather lines off, the electrical connections. If you look in the back, you'll see that there's a bracket mounted on the back of the intake that holds the spark plug wires, and they'll just pop out of there. You'll have the same on the other side. Okay, so the next step is going to be to take the 6 remaining 10mm head bolts out. There's one directly in the front that you'll actually be able to see through this opening under the intake. There's one in the back you'll need to feel. And then there's also going to be 2 8mm head bolts that attach the upper coil bracket to the back of the upper intake. And those are also the 2 same bolts that we mentioned earlier that hold the rear cross tube for the secondary air system in place. So if you find a little difficulty getting down to those, the harness up top is just held on by 3 clips to help route it. If you unclip it, you can pull it forward, and now you can get in behind it easily. with a long extension and an 8mm head bolt or socket. This is done by feel. You got to run your fingers around there. If you have a mirror and because you're not quite sure where they are, you take a small mirror and you'll be able to see down in there and remove those bolts. Alright, we've taken those two small bolts for the top of the coil support out, and now we're just going to remove the one 10mm head bolt in the back that's dead center in the middle and just from the back side of the intake. You've got 4 long bolts up top, and then your 6th is definitely up front, and like I said, you can see it right through that opening, so if you're not sure you're getting on that bolt when you run your socket down in there, take a flashlight and run in through the front, and you'll be able to see it quite easily. So we'll just drop it in, we'll take those 6 bolts out. Alright, so we've removed the 6 bolts. Now what we're going to do is we're going to lift the front and then come forward a little bit, and that will slide us out from underneath the coil support. And there we go. Now you can see that now that you've removed that, we can get to the top bolts for the valve covers. We're going to run into, we got to take this upper bolt out when we get to this right side and try to move these hoses up out of the way. It's kind of tight, but we try not to get that out of there and not be able to, or not have to, open up the cooling system if we don't need to. That's why we've pinched these off. So it's a tight fit, but we should be able to get that out of there. Alright, so from this point what we're going to do is we're going to access the right bank valve cover. That's the hardest of the two to come off. You can see you got plumbing in the way, but we can get that out of there without having to disconnect any of the cooling lines. First and foremost, before you go any further, take a piece of duct tape, cardboard, throw a rag, something. Make sure you cover those open holes to the intake manifold. We don't want to be dropping any small bolts or screws down in there during the process of changing this over. So what we're going to do first, we're going to remove this little bolt up top that holds the 2 heater hoses together. That's an 8mm head. And then down below, with a 10mm head, is a bolt that holds this tube up against the alternator and timing belt mounting bracket. Just a note, what will happen is you probably have these old brittle plastic clips that hold the wiring harness to these loops. You can cut those off, and any automotive center will have a wire tie with what they call a Christmas tree end. And we're going to use these to reattach the harness when we're done. Alright, so now we have this tube loose enough where we can move this away, and the harness is loose enough we can loop it over. If you're lucky enough, well, you can take the oil filler cap off, but if you're lucky enough, where a lot of these will take the filler cap and the extension tube out, and that'll give you a little bit more room to work. Alright, so now we're going to pull the spark plug wires, because we want to loop those up and over and out of the way, because they are going to get tangled up in the back when you try to remove it, and especially when you go to install it. And then we'll get to the 4 bolts that hold the valve cover in place. Alright, we have the spark plug wires off, disconnected off the loops in the back, and draped over the other side, so they're out of the way. And then last but not least is the PCV hose. You can unclamp it down on the base. Sometimes the base will stick, sometimes it'll come up with the hose. But whichever, we can do it. And in this case, the separator came out with the hose. But even if it doesn't, it only leaves a small nipple in the back that still have plenty of room to get that out. So that basically gets everything out of the way that we need to get out. Next, you're going to take the 4 bolts out of the valve cover. They are a 12.8mm or 5/16. You can use either, but it is definitely, you need a 12-point socket, or actually even some of the little gear sockets that you see in a lot of the auto centers. So we'll take those 4 out. You have 2 up top and 2 on the bottom. Note that they're different lengths. The 2 screws on the top are shorter than the 2 on the bottom. Take that as a note when you go to put this back together. Alright, so we have our 4 screws off, and then what simply we're going to do is move the harness out of the way. I'm going to loop this hose down and out. Now your valve cover may not pop off that easily. A couple wraps with a rubber mallet will usually do it. And you just basically peel it over towards the side of the car, drop the back, lift the front, and lift it out. You can see actually this is where regular oil changes pay off. This is pretty clean. So this is a good testament to doing your oil change on a regular basis. So we'll set that down for a minute. We'll lift the gasket down here. Another thing very important to watch. It looks like this one dropped off the bottom, but you better look. Inside the original valve covers there are little metal barrels. These act as spacers so that when you tighten down on a valve cover it doesn't crush them. Well, you'll notice right here that one's missing. You want to make sure that it's not sitting down in the head, so eventually it works its way down into the crankcase. This could do some damage. No sense leaving that in there. So we're going to search around. We're going to make sure we know where that barrel is. Sure enough, there's that little metal barrel sitting right down the bottom of the head, right between the two cylinders. We're going to pick that out of there, and then we're going to take a rag. You can even take a small Scotch-Brite pad. I would not use sandpaper or steel wool to clean this off. Stick with a Scotch-Brite. Steel wool will leave metal filings. Sandpaper will leave an abrasive grit that can also get down into the heads and end up causing engine damage when it gets mixed in with your oil. So a nice Scotch-Brite or basically synthetic material, and all you're going to do is scrub off the old gasket, any gasket material or adhesive that's been put on the heads. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to prep this so that we can get the gasket set in place to hold on to the valve cover when we go to sneak this back in. So first thing I want you to do is notice on the gasket itself, first off, make sure you have all four barrels in place. You have one side of the gasket has a valley or a groove in it, whereas the other side is smooth. The groove side is going to sit towards the valve cover. And then also take note, you have differences between the distance of the holes. Make sure you match those up with the valve cover. Alright, so what we're going to do, we're going to use, this is actually a product made by Permatex called High Tack. There are others out there, but basically what it is just a tack spray to give a sticky surface to both the gasket and the valve cover. We wait a few minutes till it gets good and tacky. We apply the two, and you have a better shot at the gasket staying in place as you're installing it on here. So let's just give this a little coat. You don't need a lot. We just want to make it tacky. We don't want it oozing. Make sure you get it in that groove. We'll let that sit aside. We've cleaned up the flat surface of the valve cover. And we're going to do the same with that. And we'll let this sit about maybe 5 minutes or so. Let it get good and tacky. And then by spraying it on both surfaces, when we go to put it together, we got a much better grab. Alright, so remember, like I said earlier, that groove that's on the one side of the gasket is basically the area where the valve cover sits inside to give a more positive seal. Make sure your holes are lined up. Make sure the gasket's fully seated. Doesn't even hurt, give her a little press. Don't worry about if the holes are just a little bit off. When you put the screw in there, it's gonna line it up. But the big thing is, with it tacked up, it's going to be a lot easier now, and it's still going to droop now in little spots, but nowhere near as bad as if you didn't tack it up. So, head valve cover is located like so, and then just like we did to get it out, sneak it down in the front. So you can already see the gasket still sliding around a little bit, so don't get too fussy with it. All you want to do is you want to be able to just get it in place so that once it's on the head, then you can do your final lineup for the gasket. So what we're going to do, if I remember I mentioned earlier, your two bottom bolts are going to be longer than your 2 top bolts. And we're going to put the 2 bottom ones in first. What we're going to do essentially, we'll feel the bottom against the gasket. We've got that through, and then we'll just wiggle it around a little bit, and you'll actually feel it drop into its hole. And we're just going to run it in a couple turns just to get it started. And then we'll do the same with the back one. There we go. You can actually feel it pop in place when you find the threaded hole. You just wiggle it around a little bit. Alright, so we have the valve cover in place. You're going to run your finger all the way around that valve cover to make sure that you can feel the little outer lip of the valve cover gasket poking out. This way we know that it's fully seated on the valve cover. Might want to even double check with a flashlight just to make sure you can see that little edge of the gasket all the way around the cover. Now, specs call for a 2-step tightening sequence on these. Initial sequence starts with tightening each bolt at 2.5 foot-pounds. Let it sit for 10 or 15 minutes, and then tighten them down to 6 foot-pounds. Those of you without a 1/4 inch torque wrench, we're going to just use by hand. We're going to just basically snug them, let them sit for a few minutes. That gives the gasket a little time to go through its initial compression, and then we're just going to do a 2-finger tighten all the way around, and that will be sufficient. So at this point now, we have the valve cover torqued down, the gasket's in place, and then now what we're going to do is simply reverse what we had started here. We're going to put the spark plug wiring back on. We know what order they need to go on. The small bolt that holds this coolant tube up against the bracket, we'll reinstall that, and we'll reinstall the top bolt. Basically just opposite of what we had. And then, like I said, once you get that in place, if you want, you take the wire ties with a little Christmas tree end, and you can reattach them. They plug right into these 2 brackets right here, and that'll help hold the harness in place where it should be. Now, we're not going to do the other side. It would be a little redundant. Your procedure is going to be basically the same as the right side. On the left side, you don't have to deal with all that additional plumbing. You're going to pop out the spark plug wires, set them off, pull the 4 bolts, set the gasket. All that is identical to what we did with this other valve cover. So what we're going to do then is, at that point, we'll get this back together, and then we'll show you how to reinstall the upper intake manifold. So one thing we're going to touch base on while we have it out is inside where this PCV hose attaches to the right side valve cover, you have simply, they describe as an oil separator, and it's essentially a little restrictor with a series of steps to it to basically allow vacuum to develop in the engine for crankcase ventilation, but not draw oil up through the system. You can see the flat spots on the alternating sides. Now, this little plastic piece fits inside this stem, which in this case came out with the hose but would normally be stuck into the valve cover, and you can actually grab it with a pair of pliers and work it out, because this end would face inside the valve cover. The top of it will just simply look like it's semi-closed off with a small orifice on top. They crimp the end of this to kind of hold this in place, so to get that out, I usually find the best bet is we can break it up with a small screwdriver, or actually take a drill bit that just fits inside of this post and run the drill bit through and just drill out all the plastic. Then it's just a matter of insert the new piece. Probably want to clean it out with some varnish cleaner or some type of petroleum distillate. Even mineral spirits works good, just to break down the varnish and build up in there. Install your new piece and put it back in the valve cover, and that'll bring your PCV system up to snuff. Just something to note. Now, if you're interested, there is a part number on that oil separator, LLJ000010, and we do stock these on a regular basis. Alright, so we're ready to put the upper intake on. We'll move our piece of cardboard or our tape or a rag, whatever we put on there to cover over the intake so we didn't drop anything down in there. Now, in the back is your ignition coil where your wires run to. And on each side of the coil, you've got 2 small 8mm head bolts. Now, initially, when you take this apart, if it hasn't been taken out already, this coil would be locked down in place and hard. The thing is, when you put the intake on, you're not able to get to those two back bolts. But what you should do is back them off about one turn, enough to loosen up the coil so it'll flop back just a little bit. This is going to allow us to tuck the intake manifold underneath, to reach back, pull forward, run the two bolts in, and get those started. So what we've done is we've cleaned off the surface for the lower intake, and then we cleaned the underside of the upper intake. Now we're going to put the new gasket on. All right, this is an ERR 6621. It's a metal plate. Then you have two larger holes in it, one up in the front and one towards the back, and those are going to line up and drop over the locating dowels that are on the lower intake. If you find them a little bit snug, like in this case, you can just take a rubber mallet with a socket over the end and seat them in. Just want to work it down a little bit at a time. We don't want to cause any major bends in the gasket. This way we get the top of the dowel sticking up so that the intake manifold grabs it. We come in at an angle. You can actually look underneath, and then we're just going to walk this back a little bit and tuck in underneath the coil. There's a number of different ways you can get this back bolt started. This seems to work the best for me. This is that tool that a lot of people call the magic fingers. You squeeze and it has the expanding fingers on the end. It would just grab around that, and it grabs well enough so that, and with the flexible end, you can line it up in the bolt hole. And it'll grab well enough where you can spin it and get the bolt started. And that's all we really want to do for that one, just a couple steps just to get it started so it stays in place when we drop the socket down in there. Same with the front. You can actually watch the front right underneath the beginning of the intake. You have an open valley, and we can see that run down. So that's run a few threads and it's good. And then the 4 tall bolts in the middle. Okay, so we have our 6 bolts started. The book shows that we're going to torque these to 18 foot-pounds. Now, in the front and the back, you have to use a long extension to get on it. We're just going to snug the back, just to make sure that that's seated. And we'll do the 4 middle bolts first. Anytime you tighten the manifold, always start in the middle. We're going to torque to 18 foot-pounds, like I mentioned earlier. Here's our click. And then we're going to jump over to the opposite corner. If you use a click-type torque wrench, you're just going to use a nice, slow, smooth motion until you feel that click. Now, usually the best thing to do is when you're torquing down a manifold like this, you're going to bring all these bolts down to spec torque, and then you're going to leave it alone for about 5 minutes or so, and then you're going to come back and you're going to do them one more time. We'll get the front and the back. Alright, so we'll let it sit about 5 minutes and then we're going to re-torque them one more time. Alright, something I'm going to mention before we continue on. This black plastic nipple that threads into the intake manifold, this is what feeds the PCV. Over time these loosen up. Either the plastic shrinks or it loses its seal here, but you can actually even back them off by hand. Check this and make sure that if it is loose, take a wrench and then just snug it in. You don't want to get too tight. It is plastic. You don't want to crack it or break it, but at least get it snugged in so that you can't back this off with your fingers. This way at least you know you have more of a better seal. So what we have to do now is we're going to lift the main harness up a bit so we can get our hand in there. And in the back, like we showed earlier, we have the ignition coil bracket that we just need to pull forward, and we can sneak our hands down in there, and we want to try to get that bolt started. We're going to do the driver's side first. Reason being is we have a ground wire on the passenger side. It's going to make it a little more difficult. By putting that one bolt in first, it'll sort of hold it in place for us. Got a couple threads on it. We'll see if we can run it in a little bit just to make sure it doesn't slip out of the way. Alright. So we still left it a little bit loose, so that gives us still some movement. As you saw, this was a little green ground wire. Not all the discos have got this. I honestly don't know why, because you normally have your ground strap on your back side of your driver's head, but this has it, and it's part of the original wiring, so I am going to reinstall it. This is pretty much done by feel because you can't see down in that area at all. Alright, we've got it started. Now again, don't worry that you've loosened up the two bottom bolts of the coil enough to allow it to move, because once you tighten down on these two screws, that coil mount will be tight and secure. Alright, so now we have the top of the coil secure. So, alright, next step is going to be we plug in our idle air control tube, set our clamps back in place. Now one nice thing about those little clamps that are a pain in the neck to unlock, they sort of make up for it by how easy they are to lock. And we're just going to grab this two tabs right here, we're going to squeeze them together, you'll hear a nice solid click, and that clamp will be on. And there you go, and all the rest of them are going to go on like that. Alright, and that's good and tight. Okay, then what we do next is we'll reinstall the throttle body. Just something I'm going to mention and we are going to do in a future video is the replacement of this little heater plate assembly. These leak quite often on these, and if you see residue like this built up around the edges or around the hose ends, you probably want to replace it at this point while you have it off. So if you do see that, refer to the video for the throttle body heater and we'll show you how to change that over. Alright, so at this point we're just going to wipe off the back of the throttle body. We want to make sure our two gasket surfaces are clean. We got the old gasket out of there, and then what I do is put the gasket on, get the bolt holes lined up, take the top two bolts in place, and that's going to hold the gasket in place for you so that once you get this on, you're not fooling with the gasket trying to get it aligned. And it also makes installation of the two bottom bolts quite a bit easier. So we're just going to very lightly put the throttle body near the manifold just so we can get these top two bolts started. And we'll run those in about 4 or 5 threads. And now we'll install the bottom. Probably going to need the extension with a 10mm on it. Alright, we're just going to run these in, snug them up, and then get a ratchet to them. We just need to make them snug. They don't need to be super tight. Remember, you are threading these into an aluminum housing, so you don't want to over tighten it and end up damaging the threads. Alright, so now we'll start over on this side of the throttle body. We have a wiring harness with our mass airflow sensor, our throttle position sensor, and our purge valve. This throttle body and purge valve right there. Okay, and that just pushes up into the throttle position sensor. And you hear a click. And then we have a connector in the back for the idle air control. You hear your click. And then this is our purge valve. And of course this plugs into the nipple in the back of the behind the throttle body. And so far a nice positive click out of everything, telling me that it's all in. And then the connector for the purge valve, and this is for the evaporative control system. Now we plug our breather tube in. And slide our clamp up. And again, this is one of the snap fit clamps. And there we go. Now we move around to the front of the engine and we put the throttle cables back on. Alright, so now we bring our throttle cable and our cruise control cable assembly over. On the bracket we started the 2 bolts, 8mm heads. And just run those in and get them good and tight. Again, we just want them good and snug, just to seat them in. Alright, now we're going to put those cooling lines back on the throttle body heater. We'll start with the inner one. This way we can get to the clamp a little easier. Push that up in place, and again we have one of our little snap clamps, and just move it back and forth till you feel it seat back into its original spot. It'll be a little tight, and then up until that point she'll loosen up a bit. Then you know you're sitting just about where it was when you took it apart. And grab our pliers. Okay. Now leave your clamp on, because what's going to happen if you unclamp this right now, your coolant through here is just going to blow through the heater and dump out of this one opening you still have. So now we do the outer. Push that all the way up until that hose is seated. Again, work the clamp back and forth. You feel it hit its smooth spot there. And we clamp that back in. Now we can unclamp our lines. And at this point we can put our cables back on. We're going to lift that up. You have an open slot in the front and the back, so you can slide the cable in place. Should be a little bit of slack there before it moves. And now we set our AC compressor back in. And remember, we want to leave this back left-hand side bolt in. Seat that on the locating dowels. And then the other 3 bolts in. Yeah, this one usually you can run in with your fingers almost 3/4 of the way down. Once we get it down to the point where I can't move it anymore, my fingers will run the rest of it in with a open-end wrench or a little gear wrench. And don't forget to plug in your electrical connector. And now we can put our belt back on. Again, we use an extended 15mm wrench. And we'll set the belt up in place. Easiest area to slip the belt back on, get everything on except for around the small idler pulley on the bottom. And we're going to lift up a little bit on the belt. Put our 15 on. And as we lift the tensioner, we just slide the belt right up and over that small pulley. Make sure you got your belts in place all the way around. And here we see it slipped off the damper a little bit. There, so you just loosen up your tension a little bit. Just make sure your belt is seated and centered all the way around. And now we can put our air intake back on. Alright, so we'll slip on our air filter cover. Careful of the plastic line that feeds from the radiator over to the expansion tank. These also get hard and brittle. Make sure that's seated on there, and install your 2 clamps. Now inside of here you have an O-ring. It's got a very small amount of lubrication on it, which helps this slide in. Pop this on the intake so it seats fully on the throttle body. And your idle air control, you're going to do the same as you did with the back hose. Hold that in place, clamp that. There's that. Okay, install our 2 clamps to hold our mass airflow sensor against the intake housing. And down here, there's our plug-in for the mass airflow sensor. Get that back on there. And then all we need to do now is just tighten up this clamp. And we've got everything but the fan back on. Right, the fan on these are a right-hand thread. If you remember taking this one off. Okay, and then just a reminder, this is a 36mm. These fan wrenches are invaluable when it comes to putting these back on. Now you don't have to have these super tight. Just a tap like that will hold this in place, because when you start the vehicle, the engine's actually spinning in the opposite direction, actually even tightening even more so on the threads. So you don't have to worry about this backing off. So we'll put our shroud back on. Underneath the radiator hose. And again, the beauty of this is that you did not have to open up the cooling system, so we don't have to do a refill or a bleed. And the very little bit that you lost out of taking those hoses off the heater, you'll just top off. Take a Phillips. And once these pop in, they only need to be spun 90 degrees, and then you'll feel them lock. hose in. And then we'll just come around the other side of the engine. We just got a couple hoses to hook back up and we're ready to go. All right, one last bolt that we're going to put in after installing the intake and getting everything in place was a bolt we took out of here that holds this one hose, which has a bracket off the bottom of it up against the intake manifold. Between that bracket and the upper intake was a spacer, and there's our bolt. And what we've got to do is install underneath. And I'm showing you where it is right now because to get in there, we're not going to be able to get it on camera. But you will see a bowl hole right here, a bracket, and that helps support the two heater hoses. Alright, so now you see the bolt in place, the spacer behind it, just to give you an idea where its location is. So essentially now all we've got left is our PCV hose. Just tighten that clamp up down there. Get a replacement clamp for up top. And again, we've checked the nipple just to make sure that that's not loose. And then our vacuum line, it's underneath. Vacuum line for the power brake booster, and that's just going to plug in. Now you see one extra nipple, and that basically would be plugged in to the vacuum harness for the secondary air. Being this doesn't have secondary air, we just have a small black cover that runs over the top of that to seal that off so we don't have a vacuum leak there. We're going to install that in just a minute. But this is just a plug-in. Give it a pull, make sure it's tight. We'll tighten our clamp here, pop the nipple on there, and essentially we'd be pretty much done. What we do want to do though is we're going to run this where this belongs. You can see the white tape there is for the location of this to hold that in place. Okay, so we'll just get our little cover for that nipple and put that clamp on, and we're essentially done. Alright, so we have everything together right now. We've sealed up and done our valve cover gaskets, which, like I said, can become almost a regular maintenance item on these. You can almost expect to do this year and a half every 2 years. So when you're ready to change over to valve cover gaskets on your 4046 Discovery 2 or Range Rover, just give a call to any of our knowledgeable salesmen at 1-800-533-2210. And thanks for watching.